All right, welcome. Have you ever really stopped to think about what goes on in your brain when you make a choice? Really think about it. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on that hidden, fascinating, and, let's be honest, sometimes totally flawed world of decision making. And I think you're going to be surprised by what we find. So, let me ask you, how do you make the big decisions? The life changing stuff, choosing a career, buying a house, maybe even picking a partner. Are you the type to make a detailed pros and cons list? Do you crunch all the numbers, try to figure out all the angles? Or do you just kind of go with your gut? Well, how you answer that is actually at the very heart of this huge, ongoing debate about how our minds really, truly work. Okay, so for the longest time, the gold standard, especially in the world of economics, was this idea called rational choice theory. And it basically pictured us, you and me, as these perfect little utility maximizers. It's a fancy term, but it just means we're seen as totally logical machines, carefully weighing every single option to get the absolute best outcome for ourselves, every single time. It's a nice idea, right? But is that really what happens in the real world? Well, that's where things started to get really interesting. Along came this field of behavioral economics, led by these brilliant researchers like Tversky and Kahneman. And what they did was they started running all these clever experiments. And what they found, again and again, was that this ideal of the perfectly rational person, it just doesn't match up with how we actually behave. It turns out we don't always use pure logic, not by a long shot. So Kahneman came up with this really powerful metaphor for how our minds work. Think of it like this. You've got two different operating systems in your brain. There's system one. That's your gut reaction. It's fast, it's automatic, it's totally intuitive. It's the system that just knows 2 plus 2 equals 4 without even thinking. Then you have system two. That's your slow, deliberate, analytical brain. That's the one you have to fire up when you're trying to solve a problem like, say, 17 times 24. And here's the kicker. Most of the time, just to save energy, we're running on system one. And that fast system one thinking, well, its engine is something called heuristics. It's just a scientific sounding word for mental shortcuts. You can think of them as the brain's rules of thumb. They're what let us make judgments and solve problems super quickly and efficiently, so we don't have to fire up that slow, energy-guzzling system two for every single little thing we do all day. But here's where it gets a little tricky, because being efficient is great, but sometimes it comes at a cost, and that cost can be accuracy. When we rely too much on our fast, intuitive system, it can lead us down some pretty predictable paths of error, and that's what scientists call cognitive biases. And trust me, there are tons of them. Let's just take one, confirmation bias. You've totally experienced this. It's that thing where, say, you're thinking about buying a certain kind of car. All of a sudden, you start seeing that car everywhere, right? And you only seem to click on the good reviews. Your brain is actively hunting for information that proves you're making the right choice, and it's subconsciously filtering out anything that says otherwise. See? That's not a logical response. It's a classic cognitive glitch. Okay, so for a good while, the story was pretty much settled. These shortcuts are basically bugs in our mental software. They're flaws we need to fix. But then, a whole different way of thinking about this popped up, championed by a psychologist named Gerd Gigerenzer. And he asked this totally radical question: what if these shortcuts aren't bugs at all? What if they're actually features? And this leads to the idea of ecological rationality. Now, that sounds complex, but the argument is actually pretty simple. It says that in the real world, the world filled with uncertainty, where we never have enough time or all the information we want, these shortcuts are actually incredibly smart, adaptive tools. They are perfectly built for the messy, complicated environment we actually live in, not some clean, perfect economic model. Now listen to this, because this is the part from Gigerenzer's work that is just mind-blowing. He says a good heuristic strategically ignores information. Just let that sink in for a second. We are always told that more information is better, right? Get all the data. But his research shows that sometimes less is actually more. That's right. Intentionally ignoring some of the noise can lead to better, faster, and even more accurate decisions. How crazy is that? And his examples really make this clear. Okay, take the recognition heuristic. Let's say I ask you which of two cities has a bigger population. You've only heard of one of them. What do? You're probably just going to guess the one you recognize. It sounds way too simple to be effective, doesn't it? But here's the thing. It works. It's shockingly accurate a lot of the time. And it's the same idea with heuristics like imitate the successful or imitate the majority. They're all these super fast, super frugal ways to navigate a really complex world. All right, so now we've got these two big camps, right? On one side, you have the view that these heuristics are basically sources of bias and error. On the other side, you've got the view that they're smart, adaptive tools. So who's right? Is it one or the other? Well, this is where the brilliant work of Nobel laureate Herbert Simon comes in because he offers a really powerful way to kind of resolve this debate. Simon's game-changing idea was something he called bounded rationality. And it's such a beautiful concept. He basically argued that, look, we're not perfectly rational supercomputers, but we're not completely irrational random creatures either. The key insight is that we are intendedly rational. We try to be logical. We want to make good choices. But our ability to be perfectly rational is boxed in. It's bounded by the real-world limits of our own minds, the information we have, and the time we have to make a call. And you can see this intended rationality playing out in your own life all the time, right? Your choices are usually goal-oriented. You're trying to accomplish something. They're calculative. I mean, you do try to weigh the pros and cons, and they're adaptive. If you get new information, you're sensitive to it, you might change your mind. The bottom line is, you're doing the best you can with what you've got. And this all leads to one of Simon's most famous and, I think, most useful concepts. He said we aren't optimizers. We don't search endlessly for the single, perfect, best possible choice out there. Instead, we are satisficers. It's a word he made up, a blend of satisfy and suffice. It means we search for options just until we find one that is good enough to meet our needs. And once we find it, we stop searching, we choose it, and we move on. The restaurant example is perfect. You're not going to research every single restaurant in a 50-mile radius, right? No! You scroll until you find one that looks pretty good, and you go with it. That's satisfice. Okay, so everything we've talked about so far has been about the individual mind, your brain, my brain. But what happens when we take a bunch of us, all these boundedly rational, shortcut-using brains, and stick us all in a room together to make a decision? Do our decisions get smarter? Or do we just create a whole new set of problems? Yeah, let's dive into the super tricky world of group decision-making. You know, you'd think that putting more brains on a problem would automatically lead to better decisions, but it turns out social pressures create their own unique set of pitfalls. Probably the most famous one is groupthink. This is where the desire for harmony or consensus in a group actually overrides a realistic appraisal of alternatives. Just picture a work meeting where everyone seems to be nodding along with an idea, and you have a real concern, but you don't say anything. You just bite your tongue because you don't want to rock the boat. That is groupthink in action. And it can lead to some truly disastrous decisions. All right, so we've been on quite a journey here, deep into the science of how we actually choose things. So what's the big takeaway from all of this? What does this mean for how you think about your own thinking? So that central tension really boils down to this one big question. Are our mental shortcuts, our heuristics, are they bugs that are constantly leading us into error and bias? Or are they actually smart, elegant, adaptive tools that are perfectly designed for the complex world we live in? And the answer, it seems, is, well, it's both. It really all depends on the situation. But if there's one powerful, unifying idea to take away from all of this, it's Herbert Simon's, that we are boundedly rational. We're not perfect logic machines, and we're not hopelessly irrational messes either. We are somewhere in the middle. We're striving for good outcomes, but we're always working within the very real limits of our time, our knowledge, and our own brain power. And those shortcuts we talked about, they're simply the tools our brain uses to get the job done. So, I'm going to leave you with a little challenge. The next time you have to make a choice, and it could be a big one or a small one, it doesn't matter, I want you to pause for a second. Don't just think about what you're going to decide. Think about how you're deciding. Is your system one running the show? Are you on autopilot? Or are you consciously in control? Because honestly, understanding your own shortcut brain, that is the absolute first step to making better choices. Thanks so much for joining.